I'll cover these topics. I'll give a quick sort of run through of the nature of the risk in London, some of the things that are at risk and possible impacts, what the Mayor's approach has been, and in doing that, I'll cover a couple of specific projects that we've had running for a while and that we're starting. And then I've got a few examples of where some green infrastructure, sustainable drainage has been implemented in London, and really to prove against what I have heard quite often over the last 10, 15 years that, it's all a bit too difficult in London. Just a quick look. EA flood zones cover a fair amount of London. Obviously, the River Thames running sort of east-west through the middle, and then a range of tributary rivers as well. Quite extensive areas of surface water risk. I mean, this is an area here, sort of southwest London, Hammersmith, Fulham area, and you can see low-lying, generally residential areas. You can probably pick out a couple of linear features, which are things like tube lines, railway cuttings, a couple of main roads, etc. So, a lot of people, jobs and infrastructure at risk. Altogether, about 16% of the land area, over £200 billion worth of property, 28% of the land within our designated town centres, and there are over 300 different town centres in and around Greater London. Quite a lot of mainline stations. I couldn't actually find a picture of a flooded train in London, so any train spotters amongst us will tell me that's a Scottish train. 90 tube and DLR stations, and I put this picture in rather than a tube station because actually quite a lot of our work is looking at things on maps and comparing those to outlines. Well, this particular bit of the DLR is probably not at high flood risk, even though it's going over a tidal watercourse, because it is elevated up in the air. So there always has to be a little bit of caution with some of these figures. 18% of our hospitals, 15% of our secondary schools, about 150 kilometres of the Transport for London road network. That's the major strategic highways. I haven't got a figure for the rest of the network. And this particular shot is an underpass on the North Circular, and in the middle of that is the underpass itself. So you can start to work out that sort of must be going on for 20-metre depth of water under there. So obviously extremely hazardous conditions. And fairly obviously, London's a big city. The population's recently just topped its previous historic high of 8.6 million. So we're at coming up towards 8.7 million, growing at almost 100,000 people per year. And that's been a pattern over the last 25 years. And we expect that to continue at least until the middle of the century, by which time London will be a city of some 11 odd million people. And that obviously in itself gives us some concerns, but as I hope to show a little bit later in the presentation, some opportunities in terms of dealing with flood resilience. I think there's three main sort of strands to our approach: knowledge and engagement, the planning system, and retrofitting. And I'll cover each one of those in turn at the moment. In terms of knowledge and engagement, I suppose the single biggest identifiable risk is the tidal risk. Quite iconically, Thames Barrier. The Thames Barrier is part of a much wider system of over 300 kilometres of tidal defence walls, bunds, mounds, etc. And a whole host of other smaller and less impressive structures and floodgates, etc. The Environment Agency have got a project which, if you're outside the sort of London, Kent and Essex area, you may well not be familiar with, but it's called the Thames Estuary 2100 project. And that's really looking at how are we going to manage tidal flood risk right through to the end of this century. And, if sea levels rise by certain amounts and climate change becomes more violent by certain degrees, well, what mechanisms might we need to consider? Do we need to think about new barriers, about setting development back, etc.? They've got a programme there that we've been engaged with for well over 10 years now. Government has supported and indeed funded quite a lot of that work for the next 10 years. So, that's something we keep quite close to and work closely but also challengingly with Environment Agency. And slightly similarly, in terms of the sort of fluvial and to perhaps a lesser degree surface risks, we work with the Regional Flood and Coastal Committee. And I'm sure you're all aware the EA has gone to the 6-year funding plans for the flood defence grant in aid. We're working in the Thames region to develop a 25-year view as to what the longer-term investment strategies should be. And we've also been working on a project called the Drain London programme over about the last 5 years, and that's particularly with the London boroughs, the 33 London boroughs, who are all lead local flood authorities now. And we've developed some fairly detailed depth and hazard mapping. Goes into a little bit more detail than the sort of the updated map for surface water. Each borough has now got a surface water management plan, and we've had a series of detailed investigations into the real hotspots and some demonstration projects. As I mentioned, the planning system is another one of our tools in terms of resilience, and this is where we really link back into that population growth of 11 million, up to 11 million people. Anyone who's been to London recently, certainly, will notice there is quite a lot of building going on. It does present issues, obviously, but in my view, it's very much one of the key opportunities to actually build in resilience. In areas particularly like the sort of the tidally affected but defended Zone 3A, new developments quite often, and I should stress, these are planning applications that come to the Mayor. So these are the big schemes, typically over 150 units, or there's a few other thresholds for commercial and retail and office developments. But we're able to work with the developers there and the local councils to make sure that that development will build in some of these sorts of flood resilience measures. And even where the risk of flooding is very low, to have built in things like flood-proof rooms or enclosures for building utilities and electricity supplies, lift motor equipment, so that if that building is affected, A, some of those systems won't automatically go down, B, they can recover quite quickly, and C, if we think back to those sort of flood envelopes, if we did get a breach in the tidal defences, it could be a pretty widespread event. So it may be impractical to evacuate people in the shorter term. So let's make sure that those buildings are reasonably safe and comfortable for people to remain in until the event can be managed. In terms of the spread of this sort of development, our London plan, which is the Mayor's planning strategy for London, identifies 45 major areas of change. So don't worry too much about where they are. They're sort of scattered around in those various dots on the map. But these are places where there'll be at least 2,000 homes or 5,000 jobs. And in fact, some of these are well into the up to sort of 10, 15, and in one case 25,000 homes and jobs. So, these are huge scale developments. And in these areas, we're looking to bring forward integrated water management strategies. I think to pick up on a couple of points from the earlier session in the morning, these are areas where we can manage surface water, we can look at what goes into the drainage system, we can capture some of that water for use within the broad area, and we can take a strategic view as to what we might have to do with flood defences. There's 2 of those currently underway, and I am anticipating more coming forward. And of course, again, already mentioned changes to the national planning framework in terms of sustainable drainage that happened earlier this year. I mean, my own view is that the government certainly did fight shy of implementing Schedule 3 and SUDS approval bodies. And I think if you really wanted to make more sustainable drainage happen, you would have taken that route. But they listened to some concerns, which personally I think were overblown. But what I think we can say is that we are moving in the right direction. There is a consistent approach towards more sustainable drainage, and that needs to be maintained. I'm glad that it's being kept under review, and maybe things will change. But in London, we've had a policy in our London plan. You probably struggle to read some of this, but it's been in the plan since 2004, actually. And I think similarly to the sort of early stages of MPPF changes, we really struggled to get this plan, this policy implemented. Really, it tells you to implement sustainable drainage wherever it's practical, and to use the most sustainable systems first and the least sustainable systems last. So things like capturing rainwater for use, rainwater harvesting, etc. That's the top priority. The more natural infiltration, etc., comes a little bit further down. Then you get into sort of tanked systems, and finally you get the discharge to combined sewers. So, but that took us quite a few years to really get to grips and get the development industry using it. But what I can say now, and again I qualify this because I'm really talking about these big scale developments that the Mayor sees, almost every application that I see now comes to us proposing a 50% reduction on the current surface water runoff rates. Many of the developments will achieve a greenfield runoff rate, and these are for storms up to the 1 in 100 year storm. Personally, I think that's a great step forward from where we were, or probably even 6 or 7 years ago. And, if we could reduce flows in our drainage and combined sewer systems by about half, we would have a lot more resilience right across London. The sorts of techniques, I won't dwell on these because you will all be familiar with them, but, we're seeing these sorts of techniques are relatively common. The last one I'll just mention, quite a lot of the redevelopment is happening on previous sort of industrial commercial sites, which are more or less 100% permeable. And of course, most modern developments have got some element of landscaping, green roof, amenity space, etc. So there's actually a net decrease in some of the permeable surfacing. The big but is that quite a lot of those schemes are achieving their reductions by using subsurface tanks geocellular storage, which has obviously got limited other benefits and indeed can present some further resilience issues if it needs to be pumped out to the local drainage network. So certainly what we push for now is more infiltration, landscaping that's really designed, it's not designed to be perhaps a particular species of plants, etc., and trees, but it's designed to absorb and store the maximum amount of surface water, and increasing the amount of water that can be stored on green, brown, and I'm increasingly seeing the term blue roofs. I'm not sure they're really blue, but I think the idea is they capture and store more water. And being quite open to the design for exceedance philosophy. Some of these areas will flood every 10 years or so, and for that to be built into a new development, I think is a quite important change in mentality, where most architects will be designing their schemes so that that would never happen. I'll just focus a moment or two on the Drain London project. As well as the sort of flood information, we've also implemented a range of demonstration projects. So we've funded or part-funded green roofs, some rain gardens, green walls, little bits of river restoration, Stockholm tree pits, and the first one there, these green infrastructure audits in business improvement districts. So we're actually able to tell a range of businesses, well, look, these are all the opportunities you've got to implement a greener estate in and around your building, your street, your town centre. And that's then given some of those businesses the tools and ideas and information to go away and implement some of these ideas. Obviously, not all of them have done, but some of them have. And I think that's where we're going. The Mayor's got a range of other greening programmes, excuse me, most of which implement some element of sustainable drainage. And just that bottom one, you've slightly fallen off the screen there now, but we did a little survey about a year ago. There are now 17 hectares of green roof within central London. So just that very central bit of London, you know, the West End, the city, etc. 17 hectares, I mean, I don't know about you, but I thought that was quite impressive in a fairly built-up bit of the city. And there's more when you get to the sort of middle and outer suburbs. What we're moving on to is, you know, really from what we've seen so far, we've shown that we certainly need more sustainable drainage if we're going to combat the risks to surface water. We've also proven that actually it's perfectly feasible to implement some of these systems. What we need is a longer term bit of leadership, an action plan, a bit of strategy to say we're going to do more of this. And just last week, we launched this document, the London Sustainable Drainage Action Plan. It takes a 25-year view and identifies, really the main aim is not to sort of say, well, we need some huge budget to go out and build lots of these. The aim and the basis of it is to say, well, think about all of the bits of land, infrastructure, buildings in London. They all need maintenance, renovation, updating from time to time. Let's work with the hospital trusts. Let's work with the education authorities. Let's work with B&Qs and Tesco's. When are you planning to resurface the car park? When are you going to replace or repair the roof on the school? When are you going to renovate the landscaping around your office? That's the time to put in some of these sustainable drainage measures, to make a surface permeable, to divert rainwater into a little swale, to put some trees with the absorbent Stockholm tree pits in them, and really try and look at their long-term building and investment programmes. That's who's produced it. And there's about 50 different actions in this plan to try and move us from a sort of, if you like, a nice-to-do thing that we're trying to encourage into something which has got a more structured programme as to what's going to be delivered. Some of the tools that we're developing to help that is a piece of work that's nearly complete. It's not quite complete, unfortunately, but we've got Atkins doing a London-wide SUDS opportunity modelling. So for more or less every bit of land within London and buildings, you know, what are the opportunities to drain that bit of land sustainably? Where would it go roughly, and I have to say quite roughly, how much would it cost, what scale, what bit of land would it take? That should be ready by about the end of the year. We've also got a dedicated post going to be created in my team next year to deliver the Sustainable Drainage Action Plan. And to be honest, I see quite a lot of this as the sort of annoying person that goes knocking on facilities managers' doors saying, look, tell us when you're doing these repairs to your buildings. We want you to do X and Y, and we'll help you out with some advice and good practice, etc. And we've also got some funding lined up from the water company, Thames Water. They've got a programme called 20 for 20 that Ofwat are funded over the next 5 years, and that's designed to disconnect 20 hectares of currently land which drains to the combined or even foul sewer, drains rainwater to combined or foul sewer, to disconnect those and manage that rainwater in a sustainable manner. And you know, we're currently working with Thames to try and identify a range of projects that would best fulfil that objective. And in the end, we're looking to try and reduce the flows in our drainage and combined sewer networks by about 25% by 2040. I'm not sure quite how manageable that target is, especially when we think of the nature of climate change, but we thought we would set something out to be challenging and hopefully close to deliverable. I've just got a minute or two left, I think, and I was just going to finish off slightly more lightly with a few examples of some of the sorts of sustainable drainage solutions that have already been built in London. As I say, I still meet people who will tell me, well, we knew about a great scheme up in Cambridge, but we don't think we can do it in London. Well, you know, green roofs can go more or less anywhere in my view. Little bits of swale at the bottom there in and around a fairly dense housing estate. Schools, I mean, we run a programme called Suds for Schools along with Thames Water, and the schools absolutely loved, even though some of it's pretty small scale, but diverting their rainwater using imaginative features, and the kids got involved and some of them planted vegetables, etc. Little bits of highway designed to divert and absorb rainwater. TfL, London Underground assets, that's a tube depot over in West London. A bus depot, green roof, linked to a rainwater harvesting scheme that they actually wash the buses with rainwater at this one. A little bit of restoration of river designed specifically to store water, and this particular river will go from a virtual nothing in the bottom of it to a raging torrent within about 45 minutes of a storm hitting. Depaving, green walls, etc. You know, these are not only functional for resilience, but they're actually beautiful to look at. And you know, in many ways, that's the selling point. You know, most people, if you talk to them about drainage and climate change, they get a bit bored, really. If you tell them, look how great it could look, you know, they really get interested. Another little one on a 1970s housing estate. This one in East London. Victorian Street turned into a little pocket park. There are 6 different suds techniques within, it's about a 50-metre stretch of what used to be highway, and now takes, as I say, 6 different suds techniques. Rainwater harvesting, again, in school. I mean, schools are a great example for being able to use harvested rainwater. And then I'll just finish off. This is just around the corner from where I live, and you know, when you first sort of see this brand new driveway, when I took this picture, he couldn't park his car on it yet because it still had to settle in, etc. And you sort of think, well, you know, you spend all this time trying to convince people, and you know, look what happens. It's quite a big set of driveway, but the materials that are available now mean that even something that really doesn't look to be particularly permeable and sustainable can be hugely permeable. I mean, I'm sure most of us have seen the YouTube clip of the tipper truck with however many thousand gallons of water going, just disappearing almost instantly onto a car park. This is a similar sort of material. So, you know, I think quite often it pays to, you know, to understand what people are actually after. This particular person with a, I don't know, must have a fleet of cars to park here, you know, wants somewhere to park them, but it doesn't have to be all bad and making our situation worse. Thank you very much.